Thank you.
Hi, I'm Harriet Tenenbaum. I am a developmental psychologist, and I'm absolutely overjoyed that we have Dr. or Professor now. Sorry, didn't mean to demote you almost there. It's very new. I've known Keon for I don't know how many years, more than one.
Quite a few.
Yeah, because I'm old, not him. And I'm so happy that he has agreed to come speak to us. If you don't get enough of Keon from this talk, I think you have a podcast, is that right?
I have a recent audiobook, which I will show you how you can get. In a second. Yeah.
Apparently, but I think it's behind a paywall. You could watch location to learn more about Keon, right?
You can, yes, you can see how I bought my first house if you're interested in that. Yeah.
It's always good to try and buy a first house, though,
Yeah.
right? So it's good. But I'm delighted that he's here. I'm going to sit down and listen to the talk, and then we'll have a conversation.
Thank you. Okay, thank you so much. I'm going to start this. Always a bit afraid of the tech. There we go. And first things first, the mouse, there we go. I can't find it. And slideshow. You're seeing everything I'm seeing. How do we get the regular?
Usually for these computers, try.
Oh.
No.
That's right, yeah. Yeah.
Okay, well, that's okay. I don't need the presenter slides. I remember most of what I said I was going to tell you. Okay, so first things first. So this is the talk. I will explain a bit more about where that's going. That's me, and that's where I work. So I do work at Goldsmiths, where I have worked, I think, for 10, maybe 12 years. It's been quite a long time that I've been there. If you want to get in touch with me, this is actually probably the best way to do it. As I've explained to some of you recently, email is no longer a reliable way to get in touch. I just get too many. And you also get too many, don't you? This is true. You're nodding? Yes. You never answer all your emails. Nobody does. So we're doing our best, but this is my Twitter handle. You can follow me on there. Also, if you want to see pictures of my face for some reason, you can follow me on Instagram. I don't know why, but you have the possibility of doing that. Also, I would like to say there is an audiobook. It is very embarrassing. But as all authors who've recently published something must say, please buy my book. You can get it on Audible. That is the actual QR code that you can use. So if you want to and you have Audible, you can reach up and just snap that. You can download the book. It's an interesting book. It's about media and bias. So it's actually about the ways in which the media skew our perceptions of other people. And they do it quite passively. So I think it's a bit of an interesting read, although I am biased. I wrote it with Karen Franklin. Any of you know? You know Karen Franklin.
Yeah.
Great. Anyone else? Probably, you have to be a bit older to know Karen Franklin. She was on the, okay, some people are nodding. Some people are like, yeah, we remember. Okay, of a certain generation, Karen Franklin is the coolest thing ever. She was so cool. Yeah, I mean, talk to older people about Karen Franklin. She's so amazing. So she is my co-author on that book. She's quite cool if you want to be a part of that. Okay, so that's me. I've already been introduced, but in case you wanted a really quick visual snapshot of my CV, that's it. So like I say, I do work at Goldsmiths. The University of London. I got my doctorate from Oxford University, and that's a smattering of other things that I'm vaguely related to and have been involved in. This one gets to be really big because I was recently president of the Society for the Psychological Study of Social Issues. It's an awful name. It was founded in 1936. It's a really big, actually American organization, but they try to be quite international. If you are not a member, I do encourage you to join. They have wonderful conferences. The last one was in Puerto Rico. Everyone was on white sandy beaches, having a really good time. I guarantee it was better than your last conference. It was so amazing. And they're also really kind. They support students and they care about things like social justice. So join them. And I'm not just saying that because I was involved in the council. And that's a smattering of the kinds of things that I'm interested in. Now, I had a real challenge today because Jay wanted me to talk about everything. And that's really hard when I think about everything. So that's me. And you can kind of loosely split the research I do into 3 different kinds of areas. So I've done kind of anti-gay prejudice in Jamaica for some time. I've done talks about that here. So I know Harriet's heard me talk about it before. I'm not sure if anyone else has. I also do a lot of things that are just kind of bias in Britain. So racism in the UK. So there's a big section of that. And then I also do stuff that has to do with things like nudity and body image. So these are all shows that have me in them. So you can still listen to that one on the BBC website, Across Jamaica's Gay Divide. And to this one as well, I Can't Be Racist. That's BBC Radio 4. And I think you can still watch this on Channel 4, Naked Beach, which is how you can use nudity to make people feel better about their bodies. I was supposed to talk about all three. I am going to try, but I have to be honest, that last one, the naked people, hard to squeeze that one in some important ways into the overall narrative. I'm going to summarize a little bit of it right now in this one slide, and I'm going to come back to it in a second near the end, and I hope that'll be in a relevant way. But the long and short of it is that if you take your clothes off around people who are not your lovers and friends just to do it, and you wait around a bit, you will feel better about your body and yourself. This is apparently true. Done a bunch of different studies on this, correlational ones, an experimental one. I never imagined when someone told me I'd be a psychologist, you could assign people to the naked group. Apparently you can. You can just do this, right? Like the Stanley Milgram stuff, it's true, right? You just tell people, just do it, and they'll just do it. It's bizarre and it's a lot of power. So you can do that, and it does work. But I'll come back to that a bit in the end. I'm going to focus on these two more, the anti-gay in Jamaica and the racism in the UK stuff, and hopefully you'll understand why. Okay, so here's a quick question. I want to split this room in two. So let's say that I would split this room in two, gather everybody on how prejudiced they were, right? And I'd split the room into a more prejudiced half and a less prejudiced half. So I want you to think about whether you'd be in the more prejudiced half or in the less prejudiced half. Has everyone done that? Good? Okay, now I want you to do one thing for me, one step further. I want you to give yourself a number. So let's say I lined up everyone in the room, and everyone got a number from 1 to 100. And the person who had the 100 was the least prejudiced person in the room. The person with the 1 was the most prejudiced person in the room. Where do you think your number would be? So if you're like a 10, you're not the most prejudiced person in the room, but you're close. You know, you're pretty, hey, almost everybody. And if you're a 99, then you've got a little bit of bias, but not that much. So can you give yourself a number? Has everyone given themselves a number? Good. Do you have to write it down, or will you remember it at the end of the talk? If you think you'll forget it, write it down, because this will matter at the end of the talk. I want everybody to have a number. This is important. Okay, here's an overview of what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to talk about bias being universal. The fact that most people, most places are biased. But it's also quite varied. The bias changes from place to place. What's interesting is what other people consider perfectly reasonable behavior, other people, different people, consider to be really biased behavior. And I'll look at those two examples. Then I'll look at the way bias is universally excused, which is essentially the list of things we say that allow us to be biased against other people and still perceive ourselves as perfectly reasonable human beings. And there are ways that we do that. And these are quite remarkably consistent across the board, so it's worth looking at those. Now look at what the effects of this is, the bias, how bias is ignored, and how, in the existence of bias, people still don't know bias is there, or they won't accept that it's there, and they won't do anything about it. And then I'll very quickly, and this part is really just my opinions and stuff, but I think it's worth mentioning, how we can address this situation in which most people are in fact biased, but almost nobody thinks they are, and how we can manage that both in our personal lives and in the societies that we live in. So let's start a bit. Some of you know about Jamaica and anti-gay prejudice. Have you ever heard anything about Jamaica and anti-gay prejudice? Yeah, okay, some people, not that much. Okay, so we can sum it up a bit as we don't like them. We really don't. I say we, I like gay people. Gay people are great. I love gay people. I am from Jamaica. So as a nation, as a representative, we don't like them. Jamaica is, you know, there are about 200 countries in the world. Exactly what is a country is a bit of a funny thing. So is Hong Kong a country? Nobody knows, right? Is Scotland a country? Maybe separate from the UK soon, maybe not, it changes. But there are about 200 countries in the world. And Jamaica is not in the really bad, the really good list of countries that offer constitutional protection. So the US and the UK would fall into those countries. You are not allowed to discriminate against gay people for being gay. You can't do that. We also are not one of the countries that allows same-sex marriage. We're not a country that acknowledges hate crimes. So if you hurt someone or kill someone for being gay, we don't acknowledge that as being worse than any other kind of crime. And we don't have any kind of employment discrimination laws either. So we offer none of those protections as a country. We are one of the 75 countries that makes it illegal to do same-sex acts. So you can be arrested in Jamaica for having consensual anal sex between adults. That is a thing that can happen if you go to Jamaica. And that is really bad. People argue that it's not used, that it's never enforced, which is kind of true because it's, again, if it's consensual, how did you know? It's a bit of a weird situation. But it is still there, and it's used as a pretext to treat gay people really badly. And it is a law that exists in a lot of the Caribbean. We're not part of the increasingly small number of people who offer the death penalty or enforce it or who criminalize pro-gay propaganda like Russia would do. So you can't get arrested for saying gay people are fine, but it's still on the bad list of countries. We really don't like them. So we're really kind of negative about that. This is one of the studies that I did. You don't have to read all these details. The long and short of it is, I wanted to measure how Jamaicans felt about gay people in a long list of stuff, a wide variety of stuff, using a large number of people, so almost 2,000 people, nationally representative samples from across Jamaica, hundreds of different communities, wide variety of people, so from very young to very old, with lots of different income brackets and education brackets and all sorts of things. So I wanted to get a good smattering of what Jamaicans think about gay people along a lot of different axes. So, how did they feel in terms of attitudes? Do they do negative or aggressive things to them? How do they feel about gay rights? You notice, by the way, the word the buggery law, it's a weird word, but in Jamaica, well, you know what buggery is, yes, everybody? Good, I'm glad I don't have to, it's anal sex. Buggery is just anal sex, but it's a rude word in every other country. In the Caribbean, we just use it. Pastors use it, government officials use it, police use it, and it's officially called the buggery law. That's what we call it. So you can campaign for or against it. So how do you feel about keeping the buggery law? And then how do you feel about gay people being able to do certain things in certain places? And when you look at the numbers, you find that apart from the negative behaviors, which is a little bit below the midpoint of the scale, on all these other things, they're really quite universally high. So they're not high only for like white men, there's not that many white men, between like 18 and 24, for example. They're not only high for the older parts of the population, the normal groups of people who you'd expect to be highly biased, they're really quite high across the board. This, by the way, is a 1 to 5 scale. It's not truncated in any way. So really, when you see these numbers edging up towards the 5, that means people really, really, really don't like gay people. And they're really open about that. And they're really happy to say it, which is a bit of a concern. So we know that other countries are biased. But what about like this country? Is the UK biased? Well, obviously the UK is. And what's interesting, I'm going to pick racism here, and I will mix in a bit of US data as well. I'm going to do that because some of it's data from my papers, and I'm just going to be selfish and self-promoting and cite myself. And I'm sure there's probably a better example from someone in the UK, but work with me. It's the same study. This would work in the UK too. Some of it's UK, some of it's US. So if you do this, again, this is one of the papers that I did with my colleagues. If you take a CV, this is actually really relevant for you guys as you put your CVs out. You're probably applying for all sorts of things, from PhD programs to postdocs or everything else. If you take CVs like this and you take 200 copies of the CV, of exactly the same CV, or 300 copies, or however many you need, and you change the name on the CV, and then you distribute those CVs so that they're exactly the same, but one has a black man's name on it, one has a white man's name on it, one has a black woman's name on it, one has a white woman's name on it. If you distribute exactly the same CV in academic departments, bearing only the name of the people involved, you get a reliable pattern wherein some people are treated better than others. And this is in academia. Like I said, this isn't the only study that does it. They've actually done it many, many times. And there's actually a really good other study that I'm not going to show you that's really relevant for PhD students, showing that if you write to a professor with a non-white, non-male name, you are less likely to get a reply when you write that, I like your work, would you be my supervisor? They don't reply to you if you're not white and not a man, as fast as they would if you're a white or a man. So we know that these things happen in the UK. I know this isn't black people, again, being a bit selfish, this is some of my own research. If you take a newspaper article that describes something that a criminal did, and you swap the pictures of the criminal, so you like take a white guy and describe the crime that he did, and you just change the picture, keeping all of the words, exactly the same words, but you change it to a brown guy with a brown name, but keep everything else exactly the same, people in the UK, and this is true for black as well, it's just an easier example from that one study I did, people in the UK are more likely to say that the brown guy, the guy with the Muslim-looking face and the Muslim-sounding name, was doing something terroristy and doing something bad, even if the words in the newspapers are exactly the same. We know that this is true, that British people do not respond the same way to crimes committed by white people and non-white people. This one's slightly more topical, or was anyway, was big around the Brexit time. So I don't know if there are a lot of articles like this around Brexit time, which is getting a bit further away. This is 2 years ago. But there's just these articles that would say, oh, net migration from outside the EU hits highest level. Do you remember these articles? This is a real article. I did not make this up. Anyone remember this? Anyone remember articles like this? Okay, so you'd see all these articles. They would never say why immigrants were bad. The whole thing was just that immigrants were bad by default, right? So there'd be these huge articles about there's so many of them coming, there are thousands, they're lining up outside, they're trying to get in. Oh my goodness, what are we going to do? So I took one of these articles and I took the picture, because they all come with pictures of people queuing up, presumably to get right into the UK and start taking our food and wives immediately. Right? That's what they're doing. So I took a queue, and it was a long queue of white guys or a long queue of black guys. That's it. I did not change a single word in the article. The article was exactly the same. And then I asked the participants who thought that immigrants were full human beings. I didn't actually say it that way. The way I did that was a little bit complicated. It's from a set of literature called infrahumanization, which is a fancy word for assigning people slightly less humanity than you assign yourself, which is measured by giving people secondary emotions, which again needs explaining. Everybody has emotions like happiness and sadness, even your cat and your dog, but only humans have nostalgia or remorse, for example. Complicated. Long story short, I asked them, do you think immigrants are fully human? I didn't mention white people or black people. All I did was, in one condition, the queue was a queue of white people waiting to come into the UK, and the other one, the queue was a queue of black people waiting to come into the UK. And the difference was really quite clear in that people believed that when immigrants are shown next to pictures of white people, and those are presumably the immigrants, these are human immigrants. When they are black immigrants, they are not quite as human immigrants. That is a reliable effect. We know that it's there. What I like about this study, which is different, it's not as hard-hitting a topic as saying, oh, black people aren't human, but it is important because of the design. So this study is about interethnic relationships. So this is a sample of about 3,000 white people who I asked, who would you be most likely to have casual sex with but not be committed to? And who would you be most likely to marry? Different kinds of relationships. What I like about this study is not that the topic is, I think the topic is fascinating, right? Don't you want to know what people think about these things? I mean, first of all, let's talk about this, right? Let's look at this line. So these are all the ethnic minorities. Look at the blue line in a second. But these are the ethnic minorities. Notice the way the line slopes. It's not huge, but it's there, right? That the casual sex is higher than the marriage, meaning the suspicion that ethnic minorities have that, oh, they will have sex with you, but they won't marry you. That's kind of true. Like it comes out, which is frightening. But you also get this massive preference for white people over everyone else. It's kind of squished together in the bottom, which is quite fun. And also you get interesting gender flips. So if you ask people who are interested in men, you get black people above East Asians, for example. You ask people who are interested in women, you get East Asians above black people, suggesting the racialized sexuality of ethnic minorities. All fascinating stuff. But what I like about this study is that it was a within participant study. So every other study I showed you, I had to trick them. I gave them an article with a picture of white people or a picture of black people. Or I gave them a CV with a man's name or a woman's name, but they didn't see both CVs. This time they saw both questions. I asked them, how do you feel about white people? How do you feel about black people? How do you feel about East Asian people and South Asian people? And they just said, we just like white people more. They were comfortable with that. And this is something that British people are comfortable doing, at least in the realm of romantic relationships. So that's quite shocking, I think, anyway. Anyone else think that's interesting? Yeah, kind of, so people are with. Okay, so we can agree that there is evidence of bias in the world. We can agree that in different societies, people are biased. What is interesting is that the average British person is perfectly capable of looking at Jamaicans and saying, oh my God, those people are so biased. They're horrible people. The way they treat gay people is appalling. Yes, you're a British person, most of you, I assume, yes? No, okay, you're not, but you can agree that the bias is appalling. Maybe not, maybe who? I'm talking to the wrong crowd. Can we see? We can see that the Jamaican treatment of gay people is pretty bad, right? Really bad. But you don't have to nod or shake your head or do anything of this. If you ask the average British person, you show them some of this stuff, and they'll say, well, hang on, come on. I mean, yeah, sure, that looks bad when you put it up in a graph, but there are perfectly legitimate reasons to want to date white people and not, you know, East Asians or South Asians or black people. And they'll talk to you about why what they're doing doesn't really count. And so I'm going to talk to you about why things don't really count and the strategies we use to make things not really count. So I'll give you a really quick thing first. Oh, I won't. Nothing's happening. How strange. Come on. That's okay. I can see. Okay, there we go. Good. Here we go. So we can do this because we have definitions of discrimination that are not very good, that are almost by design not very good. And I'll show you some examples of how they're not very good and how we fix them to make sure they're not very good. So in particular, they're not good in two ways. They're narrow and they're inconsistent. And there's a lot of research I would actually recommend that you read, from which a lot of this is based. And it's really brilliant psychologists who are not me, and their work is well worth reading. But I'll walk through what the narrow and the inconsistent mean. But it's by making these definitions so narrow and so inconsistent that within each society, we can look at ourselves and say, we are behaving like perfectly reasonable people. Those people are not behaving like perfectly reasonable people. So let's walk through what these two things mean in terms of how people are biased. I'll try that again. Oh, good, so that works, great. So this is from a study I did comparing Jamaica and the US and the UK. And I'm not showing you the full graph. I now suddenly realize that maybe this graph isn't that helpful, so don't pay too much attention to it. But long story short, if you ask Jamaicans, how motivated are you to not be biased? Their values are the same as British people or American people. So we don't think that we're biased. We think that we are just as motivated as you lot think you are to not be biased. If you change the question and you say, how motivated are you to not be biased against gay people, the values shift. Suddenly the Americans and the Brits look the same, the Jamaicans do not. It is that specific case where we are no longer interested in not being biased. And people excuse this with a realm of different kinds of argumentation. So this is an actual quote from people. If you talk to them in Jamaica, they say, our people know the difference. Black is a race, Jew is a religion, homophobic slur is a sin. That's what they say. So they say it's not that we are biased. We are perfectly capable of recognizing legitimate bias against race or religion. We are unwilling to recognize treating people who are just being bad as a form of bias. That's an argumentation that people make. And there are people who still talk like this if you talk to people in Jamaica about this. And this is an interesting thing to say. The other thing I want to point out is specifically coming back to this narrow idea. So I'm going to shift again back to the British racism for a second. I think this is not a pyramid I've created. Have you seen other pyramids like this? There are pyramids like this everywhere. Can you nod? Like really nod if you've seen it before. Okay, now really shake your head if you've never seen it before. Okay, some people have never, okay. So you can have pyramids like this. You know, you have some for racism, some for sexism, some for whatever else. And there are a pyramid of things that count as racism, like where you draw the line. And they kind of say that, well, it's all racism. You kind of get to like genocidal mass murder is obviously bad. So the Holocaust, everyone agrees, bad, right? But you kind of go down the line to things that are, you know, somewhat less severe. So maybe you didn't actually do a Holocaust, but you're involved in the KKK or in some kind of ethnic group, or maybe you just like saying racial slurs, which is obviously not as bad as doing the Holocaust. It goes down until you get to the really, really kind of innocuous sounding stuff, but it's still part of the same system. So, you know, mistaking someone for someone else. So, oh, sorry, I thought you were this other person, happens to be the same ethnicity. Or saying something like, oh, you're very articulate for a black person. Or even saying things that don't involve race, like all lives matter, even though it's obviously a racially charged thing. So part of the argument is that a lot of the definitions are really quite narrow. That when it comes to our own bias, we work really hard to narrow the range of things that officially count. When it comes to other people's bias, we're much likely to use broader things. And this will come in later. I will come back to this again. So let's take this up. So for example, this is an argument that's happening in social psychology right now, kind of. Maybe it was happening 4 years ago, 3 years ago. I was involved in the argument, which is why I care about it. You've heard about microaggressions, right? Good. Okay, everyone's heard about microaggressions. Microaggressions are, you know, small, perhaps ambiguous, perhaps unintentional things that communicate negativity about the group to which other people belong. So things like expecting your work to be inferior or your ideas or opinions being minimized, or for example, you answer the door and someone says, oh, I'm sorry, this was for Dr. So-and-so. And you say, I'm Dr. So-and-so. And they look at you, you are obviously a woman of some sort, but whatever. And then they give you, like, has that ever happened? Yes, okay, a lot of women are nodding. They know that people get confused, they don't like it. It's very slight, but it's negative, right? And so it's not good, right? And so there's been a lot of research recently about microaggressions. What I found interesting was that in the psychological literature, and this includes Western countries like the US and the UK, there's also been quite a lot of pushback against microaggressions literature. A lot of pushback saying these things do not count. And this is an effort to deliberately narrow the range of what counts as racism. And people would use words like, and these are real people with doctorates who'd be published in places like Psychological Science, really high impact journal. And they'd say stuff like, it seems ridiculous, if not a bit pathological to experience emotional distress because someone has called you articulate. So this is narrowing that pyramid. Like, you people are being ridiculous. You ethnic minorities need to get over this. It's not real. They're pushing this in a particular way. One argument that really caught my attention was the idea that these individuals may become more likely to experience negative psychological reactions following minor perceived provocations. They're becoming more emotionally fragile. So what this argument is, I know, right? I see your eye. And what this argument is saying is that microaggressions aren't real. You ethnic minorities are oversensitive. You are hypersensitive. You're responding too much to things that do not matter. That was the central thesis of the argument. And I thought, okay, well, I'm going to wade in there. I'm going to wade into that argument to test it. Because what I thought was interesting is that that is actually a testable argument. That you can check how much minor things happen to ethnic minorities and how much this seems to affect them. And you can check how much minor things happen to white people and how much this seems to affect them as well. You can run a test on this and see what happens. If you do this, so for example, if you were to run a study in which you got 130 people, half white, half ethnic minority, and checked how much these minor things happen to them and check something like their global life satisfaction, you should find an interaction whereby the ethnic minorities experience a greater dip in life satisfaction as in association with the negative life events, right? Everyone with me? Yeah? But this is not what you find when you do that. That's not what I found anyway when I do that. So when I looked at those negative events, the white people are in the blue line and the ethnic minorities are in the black line. If anything, you get a slightly deeper dip for white people when they experience something like waiters being rude to them in restaurants, people not wanting to serve them in stores, people mistaking them for someone else. If anything, there's a stronger association between white people. It's not quite significant, but if anything, that's what you get. So you don't get any evidence for that. I actually redid that study once more because someone pointed out that there was a weird confound whereby the white people and the ethnic minorities are different because they're different, not because they're ethnic minorities and ethnic majorities. Do you see what I mean? That ideally you'd want like white people who are ethnic majorities and white people who are ethnic minorities and do it again. Sounded like an impossible task. Actually, you can do it with Koreans. I had a Korean student who knew a bunch of Koreans in Korea, obviously because that's where they live, and then a bunch of Koreans here in the UK. So you could get about 250 Koreans between Korea and the UK and ask them the same question. And the same pattern emerges. Ethnic majority Koreans, if anything, are more sensitive to it. By the time they're ethnic minority Koreans in the UK, it doesn't seem to affect them as much. So the hypersensitivity argument doesn't seem to work. I did one more test on it. I didn't have the budget to hire out a restaurant and then be really rude to a bunch of ethnic minorities, which is a shame, but who has the budget for that kind of thing? But what I did have was a bit of an imaginative task. And for those of you who follow my research, you know I've done Imagine Contact and other things like that. And there is some research showing that if you get people to imagine or to recall a particular event, it has similar emotional responses to actually doing it. So I did that, and the same thing happened. If you get a bunch of people in a room, some white, some ethnic minority, and you get them to imagine or to recall a negative event, like someone being really rude to them at a restaurant, you don't get ethnic minorities responding more aggressively. You get white people, if anything, responding more aggressively. That is the standard pattern. But the whole point of this is that I had to do 3 studies, right? I had to go and do this and publish this to argue with someone who had no data whatsoever on his side, right? His whole thing was microaggressions are nonsense because ethnic minorities are overreacting and hypersensitive. And this was just a published thing. This is just a thing you can say. And in order to argue with that thing, you have to go out and do actual work to show people why they shouldn't be narrowing the definition of what racism is that way. People are also quite inconsistent when you test them directly. So if you look at this, this is a scale that a colleague of mine, so Katie Greenland and Colette Van Laar, and they're really quite interesting. It's actually Katie Greenland who was the spearhead of the main idea, the definitional boundaries of discrimination. You can measure how narrow someone's boundaries are, right? You can do that. So you can give them a list of items. You can get them to say, well, you know, racism is about being malicious. If a white person isn't being malicious, then it doesn't count. You can do that. You can see how strongly they agree with that. You can say, well, you know, if, let's say, to show that a white person is racist, you need to show that race and only race made them do what they did. So that would narrow it if they agreed with that. So if, for example, you're following someone around the store, and you could legitimately say, well, it was actually his haircut or a tattoo, then it wasn't racist because I have this other reason. See, that's great. You can narrow it a bit more. Or, you know, you can't say that a white person is racist because they did one thing or another. You have to know if they really meant it. So then you can actually take out like racist jokes and even racial slurs because you can't prove they were saying it to be negative. You know, that you have to know why they did it. That's another way of narrowing it down. So this is a scale that measures what we call the definitional boundaries of discrimination. And you can see how they move up or down depending on who you're talking about, and who they move up and down depending on who you're talking to. So what I was interested in was testing it directly. I got a bunch of white people, and I got them to answer one of two scales. One where they actually just look at this exact scale, except in one case they're answering it for white people. So say if a white person's not being malicious, it doesn't count. The other one, they're answering it for black people. So if a black person's not being malicious about white people, it doesn't count. Right, so you see what I'm doing. I'm asking them the same questions twice. Because ideally, if you are a logical, rational person, your definitional boundaries of discrimination are a set point, right? It doesn't matter if it's discrimination against you or discrimination against someone else, you can recognize discrimination or not, right? But if you are not a logical, rational person, if you are perhaps a more self-serving person, then they will shift depending on whether the discrimination is against you or not. And that is exactly what we found, that when it's racism against black people, it's really narrow. They say, no. You really have to know whether the person meant it or not. You really have to know why they were doing it. If it's against white people, it's a lot broader. They're much more willing to accept that if you do something racist, it's just racist. They don't care if you meant it or why you said it. We did another study as well. I'll talk a bit about that later, but this one I find more interesting because some people could respond and say, well, who cares? You know, who cares about this definitional boundary stuff? It seems like a silly video game. Who cares if these lines move up or down? But definitional boundaries of discrimination really do matter because they affect how people respond to other things. So for example, the Black Lives Matter versus All Lives Matter debate. Definitional boundaries of discrimination are a predictor of how much you like the phrase Black Lives Matter versus All Lives Matter, such that if you have narrow definitional boundaries of discrimination, you do not like people who say Black Lives Matter. You prefer people who say All Lives Matter. More than that, even more than that, it correlates really negatively with a whole bunch of stuff. So it correlates with things like collective narcissism and colorblind ideology and explicit racism, which is just like, are you racist? And they will say yes, and it correlates positively with that. And in fact, it is a better predictor of responses to things like All Lives Matter and Black Lives Matter than a bunch of things you think should matter more, like collective narcissism and political affiliation and explicit racism. So you might think that this is just a right-wing, left-wing thing, but it isn't. That is less important than things like our definitional boundaries of discrimination. So our ability to narrow discrimination and say this stuff doesn't count affects the stuff that we do later, and that really matters. Okay, so what do we do with all this? So people are biased, but we have tricks, clever tricks, to narrow definitional boundaries of discrimination and move them around and essentially convince ourselves that we are not biased people. And that's a fantastic thing. And what do we do with that? How do we actually do that? And what's the end result of all this? Well, the end result is a group of people who do not recognize bias, who can't do it, who, even though there is quite a lot of bias, don't know that it's there. I'm not making this up. So this is from a poll, increasingly old. I should get a new one. This is a 2018 poll, where they just asked, do ethnic minorities face less or the same discrimination as white people? And most people actually thought, well, ethnic minorities do. So the yeses, the reds, are the people who think ethnic minorities face less discrimination or the same as white people in the UK. That these people think white people have it harder. They have adjusted their perceptions of discrimination to such an extent that they believe, despite all the evidence to the contrary, that white people are the real people who are being hit with the ethnic discrimination in the UK. This isn't just, by the way, this also works for men and women. There was another poll where half of UK men in a certain age range, at least, and these are the younger men who you think would be less sexist, think that actually women don't face any barriers at work, that they're fine, they don't know what they're talking about, that, you know, that they don't see where the sexism is. They don't recognize it. They don't think women face obstacles like men do. This is not just true for the UK. This is also true in other places. So if you read articles on Jamaica or reasons why Jamaicans are great, I mean, granted, it's in the news, like we can't really hide that we hate gay people anymore. The secret is out. But if you read news articles about Jamaica or scripted consultancy articles about Jamaica, you will see that Jamaicans are open-minded, and this is a great selling point. And it is a true selling point. Jamaicans are actually incredibly open-minded, much more likely to mix ethnically than British people are. You cannot find a Jamaican who is not mixed. We're all mixed, no matter what we tell you. We're much more likely to mix politically, like we're more likely to have friends across political lines than Americans are or that British people are. We just kind of leave out the hating gay people part. We don't talk about that. But other than that, we are super open-minded. We're really open-minded people. And in the UK, we have shockingly similar behavior from our own politicians. You remember the Conservatives releasing this thing where there was no systemic racism in the UK? Isn't that great? That like, they did a whole thing on it, and there's none. It just isn't there. You know, so if you do something stupid like teaching white privilege, you are going to jail because that is a lie, and they have a whole report to prove that it's a lie, right? So we have this whole society where people cannot see prejudice as it's happening, and even the things that we do to address prejudice come in with such weird assumptions. Like you've all heard of unconscious bias, yes? Do you know that like unconscious bias training is an £8 billion industry right now? It's £8 billion like a year. That is so much money. Incidentally, I have taken up a position as an EDI consultant very recently. That is not a joke. I have done that. It's such a good idea. People will pay you so much money to do this. It's nuts. But anyway, but coming back to the scientific point, even the basic assumption that all bias is unconscious is A, totally untrue, but B, tends to lead people to be less concerned with accountability or punishment or concern in general around bias when people talk about it. If you frame bias as unconscious, weirdly, one of the effects is that people don't care about it as much. It's a very comforting corporate message, but it's not actually a way of addressing bias, which is one of the deepest and most troubling problems with the way we talk about bias now. Do you remember this when I asked you this before? So you all gave yourselves numbers, right? I'm going to make a wild prediction that almost nobody gave themselves a number that was lower than 50. I'm not going to make that off the top of my head. I'm going to make it off the fact that this is a study that I did, where I asked people before, actually 2 studies that I did. Who's the most biased, who's the least biased? In the room, give yourself a number. If you're 100, you're the least biased. If you're 0, you're the most biased. And what we found was these were the numbers that people gave. Nobody gave a number below 50. Everybody was in the top half of the room. But we know that's not true, right? Because that's not how hearts work. And fundamentally, someone must be the bottom person in the room. And when we tested people, when we asked them questions like, do you like black people? Or gave them IATs and put those scores together, even the guy who was like, yeah, I really just don't like them, and had a really bad IAT score, still thought he was above average. Everybody does. You probably think you're above average too, right? I don't blame you for this. I also think I'm above average. I give myself a score higher than 50 as well. This is a way that people think. But this shows it's not a problem of other people. It is also a problem of us. We are also not capable of recognizing where bias is or how biased we are. Okay, so this is the very last part, I promise, then I come to the end. So what do we do about this? Now that we live in a society, and we are part of a society of people who are biased, who are really biased against a variety of different outgroups, but who are not capable of recognizing our bias, much better at recognizing the bias of other people. Well, I'm not a well, I am in some ways a science communicator, but there are people who study this, who study media and study communication. And there are strategies, effective strategies for handling this. My perspective is that we must start treating this a bit like the science denialism that it is. The ideas about bias, about prejudice, about the existence of racism and sexism and sexual prejudice, these are not our opinions. These are not just the beliefs that some people have. This is borne out through hundreds and thousands of studies where we carefully compare newspaper articles and CVs and do implicit association tests and ask people all sorts of questions. We know bias exists, and it's been a settled question for a long time. We have to start approaching people who say bias doesn't exist in whatever form, much the same way that we approach, this is where I always get a bit cautious because I know I'm going to offend somebody. We're going to have to do it the same way that we approach flat earthers and anti-vax people and everybody else who doesn't believe in whatever the science says. We have to do it by rigorously contradicting the misinformation that is spread about this and having a clear message and seeing it as part of our duty, those of us who are social psychologists in the room, to do this better. Right now, we're not doing it nearly well enough. So we must take on the strategies of other groups of people to do it. And then the other thing I would say is, it's easy to look at those white guys, and they were all white guys, in those definitional boundaries of discrimination studies, looking at them as they shifted their boundaries up and down, depending on whether they're talking about white people or black people, and thinking, oh, what a bunch of racists. I would never do that. But we all do that. That is a thing we all do. So some of you are really good at spotting what racism is, but not that good at spotting what sexism is. You move your definitional boundaries of discrimination up and down, or vice versa. You're really good at spotting sexism, or you're really good, but you're not that good at spotting racism. Or maybe you're good at spotting racism against black people, but not against Indians, or vice versa. I don't know. But all of us do this. And an awareness of the fact that we do this, an awareness that somebody in this room is in the bottom half and it might be you and you have no idea if it is you, is incredibly important. Because if we don't start applying those strategies, and this is where I'll finally come in and say that thing I said. I told you I'd bring the naturists in at the end, wouldn't I? Because people are like, oh, naturists, they're so weird. Naturists are an interesting group of people in the UK because people don't like them. They're weird and they're freaks and they're perverts and they shouldn't be around children. And I know some people think that. I ask you again, when you express negative ideas about even them or against even more outlandish groups, and I don't mean this in any sense, no one is actually outlandish. I just mean in the way that people treat other people. Like it's really fashionable to be negative about trans people at the moment in particular political parties. Like that's a huge thing. Really fashionable to be negative about some other groups of people like polyamorous. When you know that you're negative about these people, are you capable of spotting bias against the groups you don't like? The way that you are capable of spotting bias against the groups that you do like or the groups that you belong to? Because if you are not capable of doing that, you are indistinguishable from the white men in that study who really get sensitive about white man racism and aren't that sensitive about racism against black people. And that is a concern. So if we're going to get good at this, let's get good at it properly and learn how to spot these things and argue about them. So that is the totality of my talk, that bias is universal. Everybody's biased, although to different degrees and about different targets. We're not all biased to the same people, not all biased to the same extent, but there's a lot of bias out there. We excuse bias in that we have a range of tricks to shift our definitional boundaries of discrimination around, to make ourselves not biased and other people more biased. And therefore, we are capable of ignoring bias, even when it is patently obvious to an external observer. And if we want to do something about this, we have to treat it like the science and nihilism it is, and we have to get better at recognizing it internally, or we'll not be that good at helping other people recognizing it who aren't us. And with that, I have come to the end of the talk. So if you have questions, now would be a good time. Thank you very much. I don't know what happens now. Do I ask? Do you? Okay, okay, cool.
A chair to sit on,
Oh,
so you
great.
don't even have to stand to become
Nice.
tired.
Nice, thank you.
But,
Thank you.
oh,
Okay,
we're
we
in
have
conversation.
questions.
Oh, okay. I think before we open it to questions,
Okay.
we're supposed to
Oh,
have
yeah,
a
sorry.
discussion.
Great, yes, thank you.
And so the first question is, can you tie all your research strands together?
Yes, thank you for that. As you may have noticed.
Brilliant talk first. So
Oh,
I
thank
forgot
you.
to say
Yeah.
it. I got distracted by the chair. So it was a great talk. Very
Thank you.
inspiring. Sorry.
Thank you very much. So it is hard. Actually, I build narratives when I talk. I think that's what we all do. We construct coherent narratives in reverse. And I can do that for my research, but I also just research things I find interesting, which is why you'll see one study about anti-black prejudice, one study about anti-Muslim prejudice, one study about sexism, one study about naturism, one study about this. I just do whatever the next thing is that I find interesting. What I would say, though, is that there is a genuine link. And if you look at them, not only is there a link in that people who are more prejudiced in one area tend to also be more prejudiced in another. I know that's not universally true. So you'll get really kind of hyper-feminist Jamaicans who still hate gay people. So it's not always the same. But the general correlation is there. But a lot of the underlying ideas that some people should be treated worse than other people are set up in the same way and excused in the same way. And once you recognize that, then you can see that there's a template for this. You realize how weirdly things like naturism connect to feminism, because there's this, you've heard of ideas like rape myth acceptance, and this idea that if a woman dresses a certain way or acts a certain way, she deserves certain kinds of abuse, which is hard to sustain in a community of people who don't wear clothes, for example. And so you have a lot of ideas that overlap with each other about the way people should be treated badly. And I can see a continuum that runs through them. But I also admit that I do what I like. And that seems to have worked out so far for whatever reason.
Yeah, interesting. Thank you very much. Can you think of strategies people could use to help them identify when they're discriminating or being prejudiced against? Because you talked about it.
Yeah.
But I don't think you actually came up with concrete
Yeah.
strategies.
So in the actual study that we did, there was a red line of where people thought they were, and the blue line of where people actually were compared to other people. And the blue line was composed of a combination of explicit questions and implicit association tests. And on some level, I think that's not a bad template for starting. So you could say, I'm always a big believer in practicality. So if you as a person say, well, I don't discriminate against anybody, but I do think that you should be able to test yourself. You should be able to look at all the grades of all the students in your class. Are there weird demographic breaks between some groups of students and other groups of students where some people get good grades and others don't? And maybe there's a perfectly legitimate reason for that, but are you looking at the numbers? If you're an institution that says, we are pro whatever, we're really pro women, what's your gender pay gap information? Do we have that to record? And if it's there, now we have a numerical record of what it looks like when we look at how women are being treated in your organization. So I always say, for me, discrimination must come down to the practical effects you're having on other people. That it doesn't matter how much you say you love a particular group of people, if the numbers seem to indicate that these people don't do as well in your company, that for me is more important. So if you can have some practical external way of looking at those things, that's where your effort should go.
Shall we open it up? Because I'm sure there are lots of questions after such an inspiring talk.
Okay, sure.
Hi,
Thanks.
Eva.
Was really interesting. And we sort of off the back of the question that Marie just asked.
Yes.
And obviously presenting people with their kind of the facts of their own lives is important. What do you do when they kind of continue to deny that, or they feel threatened by that, right? Because everyone wants to see themselves as not prejudiced and really nice. As we saw, we're not all like that, right?
Yes. So I think there's kind of two parts to that. So one is the factual basis of it. And the research does show that if you just present people with the facts as they are, and you have to be careful about which facts. So you can't just say, for example, well, Black students don't do as well in university as white students do. So there's a big thing called the Equalities Commission, and they track this every year, and they find that overall white students get more first than Black students do. This convinces essentially no one, because people who simply walked in believing Black people are intellectually inferior walk out thinking, well, that's why. Other things are harder. So there are studies that show that if you take exactly the same essay and change the name on the essay, that they get different grades. And that's much harder for people to argue with. So if you're able to just show people stuff like that, or another one that's really quite relevant for me, maybe relevant for you guys as well, there's a really great study called Judged Before Met. I can't remember if it was both ethnicity and gender, but it's that if you are a white guy and you have exactly the same CV, and then there's like a Black guy who has exactly the same CV, and you show it to students and you ask them to judge who's more competent and legitimate and personable, the white guy is better at everything. More competent, more legitimate, and more personable than a Black person or an Asian person with exactly the same, like, the VLE course pages. Do you know what I'm talking about? And these are things that students actually do. They actually rate people. And then these scores go into our promotion applications, which is nuts. And we know that the scores are biased and we still use them, but whatever. So, yeah, so there's that. We know studies like that. We know that stuff like that happens. The other half of your question, the threat, I think some of that comes from a society where, for whatever reason, we've built this idea that people are racist or sexist. And we don't do that with we do that with some things. I have heard people say, oh, once a cheat, always a cheat. Again, not true. Obviously, people aren't either always committing adultery or never. Like, that's just not how humans are. But we kind of draw this line, and we are not racist. And those people are the racists, and that's bad. And that's not true. What we are is people who do more. We do more frequent or less frequent racist things. Like, that's what matters. And you want to keep doing less and less frequent racist stuff. And if you could think of it like that, do you remember when Meghan Markle had her child, and there was the argument in the royal family about someone saying, oh, we hope his skin isn't too dark. And then Prince William found his one Black friend to come out and say, Prince William is not a racist. And like, that was the end of that. I thought that's such madness, because if someone said, oh, Keon West stole my car, I couldn't go to Harriet. Harriet, have I ever stolen your car? No, well, there you go. Like, that's idiocy. It has nothing to do with whether I stole someone else's car, but this is how we think about racism. You are a racist who's always doing racist stuff all the time, or you never do racist stuff ever, and that's not true. And if we can get out of that, I think that can help with the threat, that instead of telling people you are just a bad person, we can say, maybe steal cars less frequently and do racist stuff less often.
Or
and
steal someone else's
or
car.
steal someone else's car. Yeah. Does that make sense? Does that answer the question? Yeah. Yeah.
My question kind of relates quite nicely to what I'm thinking about. I'm quite cynical about the sit someone down and measure them right now. And that's because sometimes I wonder if it isn't static, that someone's prejudice on Monday is like this, and on Tuesday it sort of fluctuates.
Yeah.
And I was wondering if that was something that you had sort of factored in terms of like, I don't know, I was trying to think about what the application would be in the future. Like, could it be that when you're recruiting people, you make them do a test to see how prejudiced they are, to see how inclusive their values are. But then the problem with that is just like, would their result be different depending on what they did that week, who their company was, or whether they were doing it while they were on holiday in a more kind of diverse environment. So I was just wondering if you thought about that.
Yeah, I'd say, hey, you're absolutely right. People's levels of bias do fluctuate. This is true for explicit stuff and implicit stuff. So you can have variations in your IAT score just by having a member of the target group in the room. So if you're doing a black-white IAT and there is a black person in the room, your score will be different than if there was no black person in the room. We know this is true. Another study that I think is really interesting was a study where they got, I can't remember how many men, let's say 50 men in a waiting room before they interviewed a woman for a post. And half of the men were in a room with really sexy adverts in magazines. You know, the sexy, you know, the woman, she's not wearing any clothes and you're not really sure what it's selling. Maybe it's perfume, who knows? But there's a naked woman and half of them saw that and half of them didn't. And the half who saw that asked more inappropriate questions and were more leery and unhelpful than the half who didn't. So prejudice fluctuates and we know this. But you get cumulative effects of lots of prejudice over time. And so while in any given room, a British person will be more or less racist, in any given room, the same Jamaican person will hate gay people more or less as it goes, you still kind of get a vaguely stable idea of what the mean score tends to be for that person. And I think so long as we're not thinking about this in terms of, are we going to judge you? You are a bad person, you're a racist, you're a sexist, you're whatever. If we're looking at, well, how are you actually treating people? How do you interview women in real life? How are people in your lab paid, or how are duties assigned? If we're focusing on how we treat people, then it becomes a much more useful and meaningful score. So it's less about judging people. We accept the fluctuations, just like there's fluctuations in personality, but we also have to know where the bias mean lands, you know, for individuals and for organizations, because it really does matter. Does that help answer the question?
Can I ask a follow-up to that?
Yeah.
So are you arguing then that what's going to be more important then is their overt behavior?
Yeah, overt's a funny word. I would rather replace it with detectable behavior.
Than their
Yeah.
unconscious bias. Right?
Yeah, and I acknowledge that as a value judgment for myself. I would rather sit next to someone who, in his heart of hearts, is a Nazi, but always does things to support me and make my life easier and do wonderful things for myself and my family, and who I cannot tell in any way is a Nazi, than someone who, in his heart of hearts, really loves Black people, but every single policy he does, every decision he makes my life harder, makes my position inferior, takes away my money, makes it more difficult for me to get to work. For me, I don't know why it matters on some level, the deep internal. I think the deep internal is both unhelpful and undetectable. And that people can say, who's that guy? Was it Jeremy? What's his name? The guy who used the N-word on television? He was in Top Gear. What's his name? What's that guy? Jeremy Clarkson, yeah. And he said that. And then all these people came out of the woodwork to say, well, you don't know why he said it in his heart. I'm like, I don't care why he said it in his heart. It makes no difference to me why he said it in his heart. But I care about the effects of his behavior. And if you track his behavior, it's not good behavior. And so you could argue with me day in, day out about what a great person he is deep down. At the end of the day, is he negatively affecting my life or the lives of people who are demographically similar to me? And if that's the case, again, I don't care if Theresa May in her heart of hearts really loves Jamaicans. She sent a bunch of them to their deaths. Like, who cares what she thinks deep down inside? That's not my thing. And I know that's not what everyone thinks. Some people
I'm just
really
thinking,
care.
you know, because recently, I don't know if you saw with Rupa Huq, for example, right?
Okay, I don't know about that. What happened there?
She's an MP who represents Ealing. She's of Bangladeshi descent. She really does a lot for her community.
Yeah.
But she called
superficial Black persons quasi-quasi
because of his budget.
because of his budget.
Yeah.
And I think because of his upbringing as well.
Yeah.
He's an educated.
Okay,
so,
yes, I have heard of that.
Yeah.
And the implication then is that if you're well educated and articulate and have money, you're not actually a Black person. So that's obviously a racist thing. She should probably do less of that, right? I mean, I think
Well,
that's
she resigned.
okay. Good. I mean,
She was sacked.
Yeah.
She was sacked.
But I also think that, again, when you look at these things, I think I do agree that that was a racist thing to say, but I don't agree with drawing a line and saying, oh, she's a racist. And me, I'm not a racist because I've never done like that's stupid. She has done a racist thing. She should do fewer racist things. They should all do fewer racist things. And they should do fewer things that affect Black people negatively. That's important. And so I think, yeah, of course, identify it, like see where it is, but take into account the behavior and how it affects other people, because it now tells a generation of young people who look up to her and who are interested in her that Black people can't be these things and genuinely Black, which is obviously false. That is a real effect that we can test and we can measure and that makes a difference. That's the part I care about more than what's in our heart.
Can I ask you about unconscious bias training?
Yes.
I'm part of the team that was delivered unconscious bias training to hundreds of people here at the
Oh, no.
university. And we do emphasise, obviously, that you can't just say it's in your unconscious. You know, forget about it. There's nothing I can do about it.
Yeah.
And we do find that people at the end of the session, we've raised the sort of profile of bias and made people reflect on their own biases. But if you didn't have unconscious bias training, we wouldn't get people in the room to even start discussing it. So what would you do instead?
So what I could say is the research on bias training in general is very mixed. And there's a reason for that. Part of the reason is that there is no standardization for bias training. So in order to teach a psychology degree, we have to be accredited. You have to say you've gone through a certain set of steps, you've delivered a certain amount of information. We all do this process every year. Bias training has no accreditation, which means some people are almost certainly delivering brilliant bias training that makes everybody less prejudiced and is great. But loads of people are obviously not. And we have no way of telling who is who because we don't test it. What the research does show is that if you do unconscious bias training by itself, you don't get good effects. If that's all you do, tell people there is unconscious bias, and then you stop, you either get nothing or you get actually less diversity down the line because of weird kind of backlash effects. So white people and men in particular feel really threatened by it, and it becomes a curious thing for an organization to be able to say, well, we've done this training, therefore our enormous gender pay gap is irrelevant because we've done the training now. And that is a real problem that people have uncovered. That said, teaching people about unconscious bias is not by itself bad, obviously. People should know about unconscious bias. But framing unconscious bias as the only bias is unhelpful because that's not true and because it lowers concerns for other things. But also because the evidence shows that by itself, it won't increase the diversity of an organization or decrease the number of negative incidents certain people face. That you have to couple it with something. If you think of it like let's say there's a whole bunch of theft in a neighborhood, that it's good to get everyone together in a room and say theft is bad, stop stealing. But this would never be our only strategy. That would be lunacy. That we would have to also lock our doors. We'd have to have the police arrest people who steal things. There must be consequences for when things happen that aren't good. If an organization was determined to only do a kind of anti-theft value judgment training, but refuse to lock doors or refuse to arrest people who steal, then you could say, I don't think that organization is very serious about what they're doing. And I think you should do unconscious bias training in the sense that you should educate people. That's obviously important. But if you never do anything else, I find that suspicious.
You'll talk when you think about Ukraine and the British and Western response to
Yeah.
that versus Afghanistan, Syria, things going on in Africa, and that sense of humanness that we attribute to communities. I just wondered what your thoughts were about that in light of how us as an institution can respond to those kinds of things. When there's this big wave of response and making sure we do the right thing by all.
Yeah. Yeah. So I'll preface this. Everyone knows Ukraine. Russia invaded Ukraine. It was really bad. A lot of people died.
Still going on.
Still going on. Still invading Ukraine. Present continuous. I have a friend who's Ukrainian. Her name is Sasha Graham. She's a real friend of mine. I gave her some of my real money. Just gave her my money so she could go on this amazing Terminator-style trip back to Ukraine and rescue her mother and take her out from Romania and do all sorts of stuff. You could look her up. She has a YouTube video on how she rescued her mother. She lives in London now. So I really like Ukraine. The difficulty is that British people like Ukrainians too. And so some of the effects of, well, I couldn't possibly be racist, extend to people who we like as well. And that's unfortunate because Ukrainians have done and said aggressively racist things. And in support of Ukrainians, British people have done and said aggressively racist things. So there's this guy, David, and I can't say his full last name, but he used to be a fairly important Ukrainian official who said, you remember that quote? This is really sad because these are Europeans with blonde hair and blue eyes who are being killed by Putin's bomb, the obvious implication is that people with a different hair and eye color are less valuable. And if they were being killed, it would not be as tragic. There have also been explicit incidents of people saying this food is for Ukrainians, not for blacks, to black students studying Ukraine at the time. So it's quite bad. And this has been difficult because people don't want to recognize that conversation, and it makes them really unhappy. Because Ukrainians are the good guys now, like they're good. And if you say that they're now the racist, well, they're obviously bad. And if they're bad, then who's good? Is Russia good? Again, I come back to the same, that we have to break out of that simplistic mindset. Ukrainians can be people we like, who are good people and who shouldn't be killed by Russian bombs, but also people who are doing and saying aggressively racist things, and that should stop. And I think if we can focus on the things they're doing, rather than trying to divide everybody into good or bad, hopefully that creates a space where British people can say, yes, we can save Ukrainians, but maybe we can also reflect on why we were so horrible about people from Syria or from Iran doing exactly the same thing. Like, I think that's a fair way to start. Does that help? Yeah. Anything else? It's okay if you don't. I hear there might be entertainment.
I think there's food, right?
Okay, cool. Yeah.
Oh, we
Yeah.
have a question now.
I really like the stuff on hypersensitivity. Because I
Yes.
think that's so hard to work against.
Yeah,
So that was very helpful.
thank you.
One of the things that I notice is that when we have talks like this, lots of people who come sympathetic and want to learn more.
Yeah.
Do you feel like you're engaging with people who are more hardline, perhaps, or more entrenched in seeing things in a certain way?
Yeah, I mean, I personally engage with people who are hardline. I don't mind talking to the Daily Mailers and the whatever. I mean, no offense if you read the Daily Mail, I mean, it's very entertaining. Yeah, I'm sure. But like, so I'll say a couple of things. There is a bit of that. There is a bit of preaching to the choir. But I'd also like to point out that the origins of that phrase are a little bit confusing, because preachers do preach to the choir. This is what most preachers do. They preach to people who come to church to reinforce the message. That's how it works. So I don't think there's anything intrinsically wrong with preaching to the choir. I think we are allowed to help educate ourselves and make ourselves even better. I do think that's a good effort. However, that said, it is obviously also important to reach out across the line and to argue with people who do not agree with us, about which I will say certain things. So one, it is, when you look at the research, generally liberal people consume a wider variety of media than conservative people. By that I mean, if you are a super left-leaning person in the UK, you are more likely to read both the Daily Mail and the Guardian. If you're a super right-leaning person, you're more likely to only read the Daily Mail and not the Guardian. But there is an echo chamber effect. But sometimes we're a little hard on ourselves because the echo chamber effect is actually stronger for the people who disagree with us than for the people who agree with us. So statistically, that happens a bit more. So we can afford, we don't have to be too hard on ourselves. We do talk to external people as well. And then the other thing I would say is, the research seems to indicate that most bias-reducing interventions, so I did a lot of research on stuff like intergroup contact, they work better for people who are super high prejudice, better for people who don't want to do it. And I've done research in Jamaica, for example, and Jamaicans don't like gay people and don't want to like gay people. They're not interested in what you're doing and they don't care. But if you make them sit down and talk to a gay person, their attitudes change. And they change actually more strongly than if you do the same thing with a British person. So if you are thinking of reaching out to people who are more biased, this is a useful thing to do, because these things tend to affect them more greatly. And it is more important that we reach out that way. Does that answer the question? You look like you still have half a question left.
Yeah, no,
Yeah.
it wasn't a criticism.
Yeah.
It was more a sort of, that's a really tough nut to crack, and what's the things that work. And I think reverse mentoring.
Reverse mentoring works. Yeah.
Do you want to talk about your work on imaginary contact?
Yeah.
You've done some.
I've done a lot. I push. So there's a whole bunch of contact things. Everyone knows about intergroup contact stuff?
No.
No.
We don't have psychologists.
No,
So
okay,
do you mind
no.
explaining it?
Yeah. So intergroup contact is simply the social psychology word for making you talk to people who are not part of your own group. So if you are a white person and you have a conversation with a black person, that's intergroup contact. Some of you are doing intergroup contact right now. Some of you aren't. That's fine. But some of you are doing it right now. If you do intergroup contact with someone from a different country, someone of a different ethnicity, someone of a different sexual orientation, all of these things, if you talk to someone who isn't part of your group, it tends to make you less biased against them. This is true even if the conditions are not ideal. So it's better if you are of equal status and you have cooperative goals and so forth, but it's actually usually fine even if you don't. Even then, it tends to make you less biased against people, and it's one of the most reliable ways of reducing it. There are other ways as well, which aren't part of my own research, but I think are very important, like changing the dominant social norms. So even an interesting thing about human beings is that they don't actually, I mean, they think they do behave according to their internal values, but in many ways, humans actually behave just in accordance with what the prevailing social norms is, which is why if you take someone from a really, really racist part of the UK and move them somewhere else, they just do fewer racist things because that's the social norm now. If you take someone from Jamaica and move them to the UK, they just don't kill gay people. They just won't, because people here don't do that. They just adjust their behavior accordingly. And this is true for lots of stuff. So if you can change the prevailing social norms, if someone says something racist, sexist, whatever else, and you just challenge them on it and make it clear that in this space, this behavior is not acceptable, people do change. And you don't have to fuss about in their hearts of hearts, are they Nazis? They just stop doing it. It's quite nice. Yes?
Professor, thanks again for the information. We're visiting Trinidad.
Oh, hello. How nice. Actually, I don't mention this. I was born in Trinidad, funny enough. Yeah, my father is from Trinidad. He met a doctor, well, they're both doctors. University of the West Indies campus is in Jamaica. So we met my mother in Jamaica, and then they got married in Trinidad, and then my sister, well, then we moved back. So I grew up in Jamaica. But Diego Martin.
Okay.
Yeah, where are you from?
I'm from Trinity.
Okay. Are you all from Trinity?
No. Martin is from Caraval and
Okay. Oh, hello, hi. Okay. Okay, so yeah.
So I wanted to find out, do you think social media could play a role in reducing biases? Because in that way, people of different backgrounds could interact with each other. Or have you seen it sort of increase bias?
Yes, so social media can reduce bias. There are ways that it can. And it does it in the same ways that other media can reduce bias. So if in social media you see someone who's not typically, whatever they're supposed to be. So if Lizzo's playing the flute on social media, everyone saw that. It wasn't on was it on television? I don't know, but it was on Twitter a lot. People were seeing Lizzo play a flute, and Lizzo is not traditionally who's supposed to be playing a flute. She's a black woman, and that's not okay or something. I'm not entirely sure. But people didn't like it. But that changed people's minds about it, and now people think, oh, I guess other people could play a flute. Interestingly, I also play a flute. I do that in my free time. I taught myself to play a flute, which is quite nice. But the problem with social media is that it's less regulated than regular media. And because social media is less regulated, you can have systems in regulated media where you say you cannot simply have programs, all of them are about black people and they're just all about crime and music and that's it. You can't have anything else. But social media is generated by people and therefore is actually often more negative than traditional media. You get a combination of just the effects of constantly having only one kind of person available. So if you're on Instagram, you are bombarded with a very narrow set of acceptable body types over and over and over again. And there's no governing body creating this. This is the content created by the users and preferred by the users, and that creates a problem. But also you get a lot of aggressive, explicit bias. So on Facebook, there are groups about how much they hate old people and how bad old people are. And they're just aggressively negative ageist groups. And that is the danger of it. So I personally have a preference for more regulated stuff because unregulated stuff does depend somewhat on it tends to amplify whatever the social norms are rather than to give you a mechanism for countering them, if you see what I mean. Yeah. Does that answer the question? Yeah. Oh, yeah.
A quick question.
Yeah.
So first of all, I'd like to congratulate you on your brilliant book.
Oh, thank you.
But I think it's very timely and very appropriate. And you've done such a fantastic job at documenting bias.
Yeah.
Which is correct. And you've also given us, an idea of how people are getting at the problem. Just try to think more and be less aggressive. It's simple. But then there's a lot of history that infused racism and stuff like that.
Yeah.
My question is a bit complex and probably not too clear, but how can we add information to historical events that would have led them create this system and bias. This was a correct, some of the misinformation in the past. And because you are brilliant, I'm asking you this question. You may have some ideas through your thorough reading and research that help me out a little bit.
So I'm trying to follow the question. The question is, how do we acknowledge history? Is what we're saying. Yeah.
Led to misinformation and therefore bias. And do you think then there's a way that we can sort of portray those events with more understanding and knowledge, and then that would probably help as well as trying to change our behavior in order to reduce this?
Okay. Okay, I think I understand. So what you're saying is that at the moment, we're taking a bit of an individualistic perspective where we're just isolating people at this moment in time out of historical context and saying you're responding to these people this way. But holistically, if we were to take a bigger view, then we'd be able to both understand historically how society ended up the way it is, but have a better way of addressing things than that. Okay. Okay, so I'd actually say a couple of things. Your criticism, maybe not a criticism, but the thing you're noticing is a thing that has recently come out as a real problem in social psychology quite broadly. So it's that's my field, that's what I do. And people do point out that cultural theorists and anthropologists say, well, you're right, that we do this CV thing, we do this IAT thing, we do whatever, and you notice that these people are doing that. But divorced from the cultural context, we're not going to go far enough. So actually, that's something that I've also recently started to think about, not necessarily addressed, but recently started to think about, because it is a problem in social psychology that we do have to deal with. People aren't actually individuals as much as we like to think. We are units in a larger group, and we behave accordingly. And unless we understand that, that's a real problem. I do think that some of it has to be addressed through education. So I do think one of the big problems of the way we talk about bias and the effects of bias is that we talk about things. So I'll give an example from the US, for example. So the average Black family has something like less than a tenth of the wealth of the average white family, really quite small. And we have stats like that, and we talk about that. And we say, oh, that's terrible. And then we think, well, how could we have a situation like this? Black people must really not do any work. Or maybe there are just these really racist kind of Ku Klux Klan bosses that prevented Black people from getting certain jobs and that kind of thing. Most white Americans are unaware of the history of redlining, in which they simply drew lines around certain neighborhoods and decided who could get mortgages and who couldn't. I mean, it's not exactly that simple, but it's actually not far off. And there was explicit discriminatory practices where you could write into the deed of your house that it could not be sold to a Black person. And so when you look at that and you realize that that home ownership is a primary way of gaining wealth generationally, here as well, that most people in London who own a home now can buy a home because their parents had a home and could pass it on. If you were not able to buy a home, you cannot do that. That is a real issue. So we look at that structurally, and that lends weight to better arguments. Because part of the difficulty with history is that we say, well, let's cure this by being less biased now. But that's weird, because there was an official government policy to deny homes to huge numbers of people for a generation. Logically, there should be an official government policy to give homes to a huge number of people who were previously denied for a generation at least, until the balance is redressed. And I do think that's the kind of thing you're talking about.
Yeah, precisely.
Yeah.
So fixing some of the historical problems that led to this sort of prejudice.
Yeah, and I think that I agree that goes beyond the kind of stuff that I'm talking about, where you make yourself individually less biased. But I hope that by making your system less biased, so again, this came out again when the Queen died, and there was a lot of shock as people from India and from the Caribbean and from Africa said, well, now can we have our jewels back? Now can you, people were quite serious, can we have our stuff back? And people were saying really angry things. There was someone who wrote really about Queen Elizabeth, I hope she dies painfully. And people said, oh my goodness, how could you say such a horrible thing? And I think, well, I don't hope she dies painfully, but to be shocked at this, you must have never read a single thing about what the UK did in Nigeria. Must have just never known about it. If you knew anything that they did, you would be surprised if there wasn't somebody hoping she died painfully. The things that the British have done in other countries are horrific. And most British people know nothing about it. They've never read a single book about it. So we do have to do this education, because otherwise we think other people are really being negative to us, and we can't understand why they're being negative We don't know why they can't afford to own homes. We don't know why they're angry that Queen Elizabeth died. But if you do some historical research, then you could understand it. And then maybe we could do stuff like home buying movements. Maybe we could send some of the jewels back. But these are the decisions that we could make more reasonably if we had the full information.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think we're gonna continue this over food.
Oh, great.
Because you said you could stay till 3:30.
Yes, I can. Yeah. Then I do have to go right at 3:30 because I have
That's
children to pick up, but I can stay until
But
then.
we
Yeah.
would love to continue, if that right, Jen? Yeah. So let's continue over food then.
Thank you.